The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded too neatly for bad news. I remember because I was standing at the edge of the lake when I opened it, coffee cooling in my hand, morning fog drifting across the water like the land itself was still half asleep. The sun hadn't fully climbed yet, and the surface of the lake reflected the sky in soft orange streaks. 800 acres stretched behind me, rolling pasture, pine stands, fencing my grandfather built with his own hands. Quiet, undisturbed. Mine, or so I believed. The envelope was thick, official-looking, stamped with a logo I didn't recognize. Willow Ridge Community Association. I frowned before I even tore it open. Inside was one page. No greeting. No explanation. Just cold, legal language that made my chest tighten. You are hereby notified that you are in violation of Willow Ridge Community Association bylaws and are occupying restricted property without authorization. I read it twice, then a third time. Violation? Restricted property? I actually laughed, a short sound that echoed across the water and startled a heron into flight. This land had been in my family longer than Willow Ridge had existed, longer than their golf course, longer than their decorative ponds and stone entry signs and uniform mailboxes. My grandfather bought this place when the nearest paved road was 10 miles away, and the idea of an HOA would have sounded like a joke. I crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash. That was the moment everything began to unravel. 3 weeks later, I came home to find bright pink survey flags stabbing up through my pasture like warning flays. Fresh signs were bolted to my fence. No trespassing. HOA property. A man in khakis and a polo shirt stood near my dock, clipboard in hand, explaining calmly that portions of my land had been reclassified. The lake, he said, was now considered a shared community feature. My dock? Unauthorized. My fence? In violation. I felt the ground shift under my boots, not physically, but in that deeper way where certainty cracks. These people weren't asking. They weren't negotiating. They were informing me, and that scared me. I inherited the ranch after my grandfather passed, along with all the things no one else wanted to deal with. Old equipment, tax paperwork, boundary maps that predated GPS 800 acres just outside a booming suburban development. To one side, Willow Ridge, a gated HOA with lawyers, committees, and money. To the other, untouched land in the lake my grandfather spent 15 years carving out with borrowed machinery and stubborn pride. For decades, the ranch existed quietly, minding its own business. Then the houses crept closer. Property values soared. And suddenly, my land wasn't just land anymore, it was potential. At first, the HOA was friendly. Representatives showed up with smiles and pamphlets, talking about community integration and shared amenities. They suggested walking trails along my fence line, asked if residents could fish in the lake. One even floated the idea of a scenic boardwalk. I said no, every time. That's when the tone changed. The letters shifted from neighborly to legal. Words like non-compliance and ordinance alignment replaced smiles. They claimed a zoning update, quietly filed years earlier, had pulled part of my ranch into a development overlay. According to them, the lake wasn't private anymore. It was stormwater infrastructure, serving their community. They said I owed back HOA dues, tens of thousands of dollars, for a community I never joined. I assumed it was a bluff, that common sense, or at least basic property law, would shut it down. I didn't realize how far they were willing to go until the day I found a construction crew standing on my shoreline. They were unloading lumber, measuring, marking spots with spray paint. I told them to leave. They said they had authorization. I called the sheriff. He looked at the paperwork, sighed, and said it was a civil matter. Nothing he could do. That night, I walked the perimeter of the ranch with a flashlight. Fence posts had been moved. Survey markers cut through grazing land. Gates I'd never locked before were suddenly chained shut, with HOA tags hanging from them. It felt like an invasion carried out quietly, politely, with paperwork instead of weapons. Friends told me to back down. Settle. Sell. HOAs don't lose. They'll drain you dry. You can't fight city planning. But every step across that land reminded me why I couldn't. My grandfather's fingerprints were everywhere. Rusted hinges he welded himself, trees planted in uneven rows, the dock boards worn smooth by decades of boots. He used to say land only stays yours if you're willing to defend it. So I started digging. Old filing cabinets, deeds yellowed with age, hand-drawn boundary maps, tax records going back generations, lake excavation permits from the 1970s, mineral rights documents no one had thought to challenge. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. The HOA's claim rested on assumptions, not finalized law, a boundary shift that were proposed but never legally completed. Land they treated as theirs without ever owning it. And then I found something that made my lawyer go quiet. A filing error. A big one. The HOA had been enforcing rules and collecting dues on parcels they never legally controlled. By reaching for my land, they'd exposed the flaw. That's when the fear started to fade. Because they thought I was isolated. They thought I'd panic, sell, or cave. They didn't realize they'd picked a fight with someone who had time, records, and nothing left to lose. By the time the cease and desist letters arrived, threatening foreclosure and seizure, I was ready. They believed they could take my land. What they didn't know yet was how badly they were about to regret trying. The lawsuit arrived the way storms do on the lake. Quiet at first, almost polite, and then suddenly unavoidable. It came by certified mail, thick and heavy, stamped with urgency. Willow Ridge Community Association versus me. The language inside was dense, confident, and aggressive. They weren't just asserting control anymore. They were demanding it. The HOA sought a court order granting them access rights to the lake, authority to remove my fencing, and permission to enforce their bylaws across what they claimed was integrated community land. In plain terms, they wanted the judge to say my ranch wasn't really mine. I sat at the kitchen table long after sunset, reading the filing again and again. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like restless whispers. Every line of the lawsuit carried the same assumption, that I'd fold, that I'd settle, that I didn't have the resources or the nerve to fight. They were wrong. The next morning, I met my attorney, a quiet woman named Rachel who had built her reputation on land-use disputes no one else wanted. She didn't interrupt while I explained everything. She just listened, flipping through copies of deeds and maps I'd brought in a battered folder. Halfway through, she stopped turning pages. "Do they realize what they've done?" she asked. I blinked. "What do you mean?" She tapped a finger on one document, the zoning overlay map the HOA was relying on. They are asserting authority over land that was never annexed, not even provisionally. This isn't just overreach. It's reckless. For the first time since this started, I felt something shift. Not relief exactly, but possibility. Rachel explained that HOAs thrive on intimidation. Most people don't fight back because the process is expensive, confusing, and emotionally draining. The HOA knew that. They'd counted on it. What they hadn't counted on was someone who could trace ownership back decades and prove continuity without interruption. The strategy was simple in theory and brutal in execution. Force them to prove every inch of their claim. And that's where things got interesting. We filed our response within the week. A full denial, a counterclaim, trespass, illegal seizure, interference with property rights. We demanded removal of their signs, restoration of fencing, and damages for lost use of land. The HOA responded the way bullies always do when challenged. They escalated. Within days, they locked one of the access roads that crossed my own property, claiming it was now a community easement. Residents began showing up at the lake, insisting they had the right to be there. One man tried to fish off my dock and told me I should be grateful the HOA was improving my land value. Rachel advised me to document everything. So I did. Photos, videos, timestamps, license plates, every conversation recorded, every sign photographed before it was removed, every fence post reset. The ranch became a living evidence file. The first hearing was scheduled for early spring. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No dramatic benches or grand chandeliers. Just wood, fluorescent lights, and the quiet weight of decisions that change lives. The HOA showed up in force. 3 lawyers, 2 board members, and a consultant with rolled-up maps under his arm. They smiled when they saw me sitting alone at the defense table. Then Rachel walked in. The smiles faded. The HOA's lead attorney opened with confidence, painting a picture of a cooperative community burdened by a non-compliant landowner obstructing shared resources. He spoke about stormwater management, public benefit, and modern development needs. When he finished, Rachel stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue philosophy. She laid out facts, deeds, dates, recorded boundaries, tax payments made by my family uninterrupted for over 50 years, lake permits issued to my grandfather long before Willow Ridge was incorporated, zoning overlays proposed, but never adopted, a missing signature, an unfiled annexation. She ended with one sentence that seemed to hang in the air. You cannot seize what you never legally owned. The judge didn't rule that day. Instead, he ordered discovery, and that's when the HOA made their biggest mistake. Discovery meant opening their records, emails, internal memos, board meeting minutes, financials, and buried inside those documents was something none of us expected: acknowledgement. In multiple internal discussions, board members openly admitted they weren't sure where their authority ended. One email referenced my land specifically, calling it a gray area worth pushing. Another mentioned that if they moved fast enough, I'd likely settle to avoid costs. Rachel read those emails twice, then looked up at me. They knew, she said. They just didn't care. That changed everything. The second hearing was tense. The HOA tried to downplay the emails, calling them informal discussion. The judge wasn't amused. He questioned why enforcement actions had been taken before boundaries were confirmed, why construction had begun without clear ownership, why residents were encouraged to use land under dispute. For the first time, the HOA looked nervous. Outside the courthouse, one of the board members tried to talk to me. He suggested mediation, a compromise, shared access, reduced dues. I told him no, because this wasn't about money anymore. It was about precedent. If they won, even partially, it meant no landowner bordering an HOA was truly safe. It meant paperwork could erase history. It meant possession could be taken first and justified later. The final hearing was set for midsummer. By then, the narrative had flipped. The HOA wasn't protecting a community anymore. They were defending a land grab. Witnesses testified. Surveyors contradicted each other. Rachel dismantled the HOA's maps line by line, showing inconsistencies even their own consultant couldn't explain. When it was over, the judge leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. Then he ruled. The HOA had no authority over my land, no claim to the lake, no right to enforce bylaws, collect dues, or restrict access. Their actions constituted trespass and illegal seizure. They were ordered to remove all signage, restore the land, and pay damages. The gavel came down with a sound that echoed in my chest. I walked out of the courtroom not just with my land intact, but with something more powerful. Proof. Proof that even institutions built on confidence and control can crumble when confronted with truth. And Willow Ridge? They weren't done yet. They still had to face what came next. The victory in court felt surreal. I remember standing outside the courthouse, the summer sun hot on my neck, watching people move in and out of the glass doors, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. 800 acres, intact, untouched, mine. The weight of it all hit me only when I stepped back onto the dock at the lake that evening. The water shimmered in gold and orange, untouched, unclaimed. But freedom, I quickly realized, is rarely quiet. The moment news of the ruling reached Willow Ridge, the HOA shifted tactics. If legal intimidation hadn't worked, they decided to wage a battle of attrition. Overnight, residents who had been friendly, or at least neutral, began questioning every move I made. Trailheads were blocked with private property signs. Hikers and joggers appeared along my boundaries with cameras. Emails arrived from board members requesting documentation of land use and proof of ongoing compliance. The tone had changed from bureaucratic politeness to thinly veiled harassment. I had no illusions. They were testing me, seeing how far they could push before I cracked. So I pushed back harder. I installed security cameras along the perimeters, motion sensors at access points, and motion lights that flared like silent warning signals when someone stepped into my territory. I patrolled daily, logging trespassers, documenting every instance of disruption. I made calls, sent letters, and maintained a meticulous record of every interaction. Slowly, the tables began to turn. Willow Ridge residents, once emboldened by their perception of authority, started thinking twice before trespassing. But the psychological warfare cut deeper than the physical. My mornings no longer began with peace and fog on the lake. They began with checking cameras, reviewing emails, confirming fence lines. I began to see shadows in every corner of my land, suspicious footprints in the mud, tire tracks in the grass that weren't mine, empty envelopes tossed near the mailbox. Every day became a quiet battle against paranoia, and I realized that holding your ground is often as much mental as it is legal. One afternoon, I received a particularly unsettling email. It was unsigned, with no header, and simply read, "You may have won in court, but everyone has a breaking point. Don't make us prove yours." My stomach dropped. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Then I realized ignoring threats is what allows them to grow. I forwarded the message to Rachel, who, after reading it, calmly explained, "It's intimidation. Standard tactic. Document it. Report it. Don't let it shift your focus. They are testing, not threatening." Her words steadied me, but the unease lingered. Even with cameras, locks, and legal documents, I couldn't shake the sense that this was far from over. The HOA had lost in court, yes, but losing a lawsuit rarely means giving up entirely. If anything, it made them more determined. The first major escalation came when the HOA attempted to challenge the judge's ruling. They filed an appeal, claiming procedural errors, disputing evidence, and questioning the validity of survey maps. Their arguments were convoluted, dripping with legalese, but one thing was clear. They weren't just fighting me. They were trying to rewrite reality, to convince anyone reading the filings that my grandfather's legacy was somehow invalid, that my ownership was secondary to a community-created bureaucracy. Rachel and I prepared for the appeal meticulously. We went line by line through all documents, countering every claim, reinforcing boundaries, gathering additional evidence from old tax rolls, historic maps, and even photographs from neighbors who had lived near the lake before Willow Ridge existed. Every meeting, every call, every note added layers to a case that was becoming bulletproof. Meanwhile, the HOA tried more creative methods to assert control. Flyers appeared in local mailboxes, warning residents that the lake area may have restricted access despite the ruling. They reached out to local media, spinning a narrative of a difficult landowner holding the community hostage. Some neighbors approached me cautiously, unsure what to believe, some apologetic for being caught up in the misinformation. I realized something crucial. This battle was no longer just mine. It had become a public story, a cautionary tale about standing up to a system that assumed it could act without accountability. I started documenting everything more publicly, videos of the lake, posts about the ranch's history, old maps showing legitimate boundaries. Transparency became a weapon. People could see the truth for themselves. One evening, while reviewing security footage, I noticed something odd, a group of HOA board members walking along the boundary that separated their land from mine. They weren't just surveying, they were mapping, measuring, taking notes. It was the same behavior I had seen before the lawsuit, but now it was under the guise of community oversight. I confronted them in person. The exchange was tense but polite, the kind of conversation that carries unspoken threats beneath a calm surface. They denied any wrongdoing. They claimed to be monitoring shared environmental impact and ensuring compliance with county regulations. I remained calm, reminding them that their authority had been struck down in court. I documented everything: audio, video, written statements. Rachel advised caution but also highlighted a silver lining. The HOA was overplaying its hand. Every move they made after the court ruling became evidence of harassment, of attempting to undermine rightful ownership, of acting outside legal authority. Each attempt to intimidate or manipulate would strengthen my position should future legal actions arise. Then came the most unexpected ally, local government. When I reported repeated trespassing and documented intimidation attempts, county officials began taking notice. Surveyors were sent to verify boundaries independently. Law enforcement documented trespassing incidents, and eventually, one county official even complimented the thoroughness of my record keeping. He told me, "Most people don't come prepared like this. You're making their actions look sloppy, illegal, and ridiculous. By midsummer, the HOA public narrative was faltering. Their appeals were slow, expensive, and increasingly difficult to justify. Residents began questioning board decisions, some privately siding with me, some publicly refusing to participate in further intimidation tactics. The balance of power, once entirely in their favor, was shifting. Despite the victories, I remained vigilant. Every day on the ranch was a blend of relief and tension. I repaired fences, maintained the lake, patrolled trails, and ensured my property rights were unmistakably clear. I also spent long evenings studying the HOA's filings, planning strategies, and reinforcing legal protections. What had started as a fight for my land had become a lesson in endurance, strategy, and the patience required to protect what is rightfully yours. By the end of the summer, I realized something profound. This was bigger than a court case. It was about principle, history, and the understanding that legacy matters. My grandfather had built this ranch with sweat, vision, and stubbornness. He didn't just pass down land. He passed down a responsibility to protect it, a blueprint for perseverance, and a sense of unyielding ownership that extended far beyond legal documents. And while Willow Ridge would continue to test the limits of that ownership, every action they took, every appeal they filed, every attempt to intimidate me only reinforced a lesson. Standing firm is rarely easy, but it is often the only way to ensure justice prevails. The battle wasn't over. The appeal still loomed, and there will be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in months, I could sit on the dock at sunset and feel the water under my feet without the gnawing fear that it might all be taken away. I knew the real fight wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in persistence, in vigilance, and in refusing to let intimidation dictate reality. And I was ready. The tension on the ranch reached a new level that fall. The appeal process was dragging on, moving slower than molasses in winter, but Willow Ridge had shifted strategies again. The legal intimidation hadn't worked. The public narrative hadn't worked. Now they were testing boundaries in ways that could only be described as audacious. One Friday morning, I pulled into the driveway to find a construction crew park along the far edge of my property. They had heavy machinery, measuring tools, and an assortment of cones and flags. My blood ran cold. This wasn't about maps or papers anymore. This was about boots on my soil, their assumption that victory was inevitable simply because they were bold enough to try. I grabbed my camera and recorded everything from the edge of the trees. As I approached, a man in a safety vest saw me and called out, "We're just surveying for the HOA, private property, not your concern." I took a deep breath and approached slowly, keeping my voice calm but firm. "You're on my land. Leave now, or I'll call law enforcement." He shrugged, as if shrugging could erase a trespass. "We have authorization," he said again, the phrase dripping with rehearsed confidence. I didn't argue. I called the sheriff, who said he could document trespassing and remove the crew if needed. While waiting, I circled my property, checking cameras, making notes. Every inch they touched, I recorded. Every footstep became evidence. When law enforcement arrived, the crew reluctantly packed up and left. I stayed with the sheriff while he filed a report, making sure every detail was captured. The incident left me shaken, but it also crystallized something. Willow Ridge wasn't just trying to win. They were testing my patience, my endurance, and my ability to defend my land in real time. That week, I began preparing for their next move. I improved fencing, added motion sensors, and set up strategically placed cameras. But I also realized that physical defenses weren't enough. To protect 800 acres, I needed strategy. I needed to anticipate their every step. The breakthrough came in a quiet moment. I was reviewing old HOA board minutes Rachel had obtained during discovery. Buried in one, I found a plan outlining how they intended to gradually annex neighboring parcels, my land included, by creating disputes over shared amenities, stormwater management, and public easements. They had mapped out access points, surveyed paths to the lake, and even identified residents who could be persuaded to support their claim. It was audacious. It was meticulous. And it gave me an idea. If they were mapping my land and trying to manipulate neighbors, I could use the same strategy against them. I began reaching out to residents who bordered the ranch, explaining the situation without sounding confrontational. I showed them deeds, maps, and old photographs, proving the land had always been private. Slowly, skepticism turned into support. Neighbors who had previously been intimidated by the HOA's reputation began siding with me, offering information about the board's tactics, witnessing suspicious activity, and even documenting missteps. Meanwhile, Willow Ridge escalated in subtler ways. Flyers appeared warning the community that the lake might be restricted and implying that I was hostile to residents. Anonymous emails circulated, painting me as unreasonable and combative. I maintained meticulous records of every instance, ensuring nothing could be dismissed as hearsay. By early October, I had transformed the ranch into something more than a home. It was a fortress of evidence. Motion sensors, cameras, strategically cleared lines of sight, and a network of watchful neighbors created an ecosystem where trespassers couldn't operate without being noticed. And that's when I started noticing patterns. One morning, the cameras caught something unusual. A group of HOA members entering the property through a seldom-used trail on the far west side. They weren't attempting to negotiate or survey politely. They were moving with intent, measuring, marking, and even taking photographs of fencing and vegetation. I called Rachel immediately. She advised patients. Document. Don't confront. Let them expose themselves. The next day, I quietly followed the patterns on the camera feed. I discovered that they were targeting three main areas: the shoreline near the dock, the edge of the pasture bordering their property, and a grove of pines where I kept equipment. Their movements were systematic, and their goal was clear: identify weak points in my defenses. That evening, I set subtle traps, not harmful, just deterrents. Motion lights in areas they had visited, subtle cameras in the trees, and even a small digital recorder hidden near the dock. Each device captured movement, audio, and timestamps. I wasn't just defending land anymore. I was gathering proof that every step they took was a deliberate attempt to violate property rights. Within a week, the strategy began to pay off. A confrontation occurred near the shoreline, where I caught two board members walking along my dock area. They were surprised to see me, and even more surprised when I calmly told them they were trespassing. I called law enforcement, showing video evidence from the previous week, which revealed patterns of repeated intrusion. The officers documented everything, and this time, the HOA had no plausible defense. The tension between the HOA and me escalated, but something shifted. Public opinion started to swing. Local newspapers picked up the story. Neighbors began openly siding with me, and the HOA's attempts to discredit me began to crumble under scrutiny. Each attempt at intimidation became another piece of evidence of harassment, strengthening my legal position. But it wasn't just about law anymore. It became about psychology. Every move I made was measured, every response calculated. I learned to anticipate their behavior, predict their next steps, and use their own overconfidence against them. They believed audacity could win where logic failed, but I discovered that patience, preparation, and persistence were far stronger weapons. The final escalation in Section 4 came during a particularly cold morning in November. I arrived at the ranch to find markers in the pasture, measuring equipment, and what looked like stakes of construction near the old dock. The HOA had clearly planned to start building, assuming the appeal process would drag on long enough that I would be forced to let them operate unchecked. I calmly documented everything, then confronted the crew while filming the encounter. "This is private property. You do not have permission to be here," I said. "Leave immediately." They hesitated but complied when I mentioned the sheriff had already been notified. I knew the footage would be invaluable. That night, Rachel and I reviewed the recordings. They were thorough: audio, video, timestamps, even GPS coordinates of their movements. We realized that every attempt by the HOA to encroach on the property, every act of intimidation, was now recorded. The appeal was no longer just a legal battle. It had become a mountain of evidence stacked against them. By the end of Section 4, I had transformed my ranch into more than a home. It was a fortress of proof, a living testament to the principle that no amount of bullying or bureaucracy could erase rightful ownership. Willow Ridge had tested me in every way, legally, psychologically, and physically, but I had adapted. I had learned their methods, anticipated their moves, and now every incursion they attempted only strengthened my position. The next step would be decisive. I had evidence, allies, and strategy. The HOA might still have resources and audacity, but I had something stronger: preparation, persistence, and proof that their entire campaign rested on intimidation rather than law. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like the ranch wasn't just being defended. It was winning. By winter, the tension had reached a breaking point. The HOA had exhausted nearly every tactic they could legally or illegally attempt to intimidate me. Trespassing, flyers, media manipulation, anonymous threats. Yet, despite months of harassment, their efforts only strengthened my resolve and bolstered my evidence. Every act of aggression, every overreach, had been documented, time-stamped, and preserved in meticulous detail. Rachel called it the calm before the storm. And she wasn't wrong. The final hearing of the appeal was scheduled for late December. A small courtroom, cold and stark, felt impossibly tense as I walked in that morning. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and anxiety. The judge had reviewed the discovery materials beforehand, and the weight of the evidence seemed to hum in the room like electricity. The HOA entered with confidence. As always, their team of attorneys in crisp suits, faces unreadable. They carried thick folders, hoping perhaps that the sheer bulk of paperwork would impress or intimidate. I had only my folder, my maps, my photos, and the digital evidence I had painstakingly collected over months, but I knew the truth was far stronger than any stack of paper. The hearing began with the HOA's counsel presenting their case. They spoke of community benefits, shared resources, and preliminary claims to land use, repeating the same arguments they had tried throughout the year. But the judge interrupted frequently, asking for proof, timelines, and legal justification. It became immediately clear the mountain of evidence Rachel and I had assembled wasn't just impressive, it was unassailable. When it was my turn, I didn't speak at length. I presented the facts, clearly and methodically: historic deeds proving ownership for generations, original lake permits, photos of every disputed boundary over the past 50 years, timestamps of trespassing incidents, and audio recordings capturing intimidation attempts. I walked the judge through every map, every survey, every email from HOA board members admitting uncertainty about boundaries. Rachel leaned over and whispered once, "They are trapped by their own overconfidence. Every lie they told now helps us." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of fatigue and adrenaline. This wasn't just about winning. It was about exposing the truth. The courtroom paused as one piece of evidence drew audible reactions, a video compilation showing multiple HOA board members entering my property repeatedly, measuring, marking, and taking notes, all while ignoring repeated warnings and trespass notices. The judge's expression was unreadable, but even I could tell he was impressed by the precision of the documentation. Then came the turning point. During cross-examination, one of the HOA's board members was confronted with internal emails Rachel had uncovered months ago. In these emails, the board openly discussed targeting my property, using community engagement as a facade, and relying on the likelihood that I would settle due to legal fees and harassment. The witness stumbled, flustered, and admitted under oath that the board had indeed considered using intimidation tactics. The room went quiet. The judge leaned forward. "You're suggesting that your board knowingly attempted to coerce a landowner into relinquishing property through fear?" he asked. The witness hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, that is correct, Your Honor." The implications were staggering. The HOA's defense had shifted from legal authority to moral justification, and that defense had collapsed entirely. Months of careful harassment, repeated trespasses, and documented intimidation were now officially part of the record. Rachel stood, calmly summarizing the evidence for the court. She pointed to each documented trespass, every email, every video, every timeline of harassment. "Your Honor, this is not a case about property law alone," she said. "It is a case about abuse of power. The HOA repeatedly acted outside its authority, attempting to seize property through intimidation and misrepresentation. These actions violate not only civil law, but the basic principles of ownership and fairness." For the first time, I felt a sense of vindication. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was moral validation. Every sleepless night, every confrontation, every painstakingly recorded incident had led to this moment. The HOA's attorneys tried to regain control. They argued technicalities, procedural nuances, and the supposed benefits of shared land. But their arguments rang hollow. Their own board's emails, captured under discovery, undermined every claim. The judge repeatedly asked for legal authority they could not provide, exposing the thin veneer of legitimacy that had masked months of overreach. Hours passed like a slow tide, each wave washing away the HOA's credibility. By the end of the day, it was clear who held the moral and legal high ground. The judge excused the court to deliberate. Outside, the winter sun glinted on the frozen lake, casting reflections across the surface like a silent audience watching the final act. I stepped outside, took a deep breath, and felt the weight of months lift slightly. But I also knew that the court's ruling, while decisive, would be followed by logistical challenges. The HOA would have to remove all remaining markers, fences, and signage, and there would likely be appeals and compliance enforcement to ensure no further encroachment occurred. A week later, the verdict arrived. The HOA had been decisively defeated. The judge ordered full restoration of all disputed land and boundaries to my ownership, immediate removal of all signage barriers and trespass encroachments, compensation for damages caused by harassment, legal fees, and interrupted property use, a formal injunction preventing the HOA from interfering with my property in the future. The courtroom erupted quietly. Well, for a courtroom. Rachel smiled, giving me a brief nod. For the first time in a year, I felt relief, not just because the ruling was favorable, but because justice had been recognized in a way that couldn't be ignored. The aftermath was almost surreal. Within days, the HOA began complying. Signs were removed, fences restored, and residents who had been caught up in misinformation started apologizing for misunderstandings. Some had witnessed firsthand the intimidation tactics and expressed support quietly but sincerely. The lake, the dock, the pasture, every inch of my ranch was reaffirmed as private property, protected by both law and community recognition. But the most satisfying moment came quietly, one evening, on the dock. I sat with a cup of coffee as the sun set behind the pines, the water reflecting gold and crimson streaks. The snow crunched underfoot, and for the first time in months, the air felt calm. 800 acres stretched out, untouched by bureaucracy or intimidation. Every tree, every blade of grass, every ripple in the water was mine, and I knew I had earned it, not just through inheritance, but through vigilance, preparation, and refusing to back down when a powerful institution assumed it could intimidate me into compliance. I had documented again, and defended every foot of ground. The HOA's audacity had been its undoing. They overreached, recorded and exposed, turned their own power against them. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I felt something my grandfather had once described, a quiet, unshakable satisfaction that comes from standing firm. Land isn't just soil, water, or trees. It's history, responsibility, and proof of persistence. And after this battle, I understood the truth of that lesson more deeply than ever. Willow Ridge had lost in court, but more importantly, their tactics had failed. Their intimidation had backfired. Their narrative had crumbled, and my grandfather's legacy, the ranch, the lake, the open fields, remained intact, stronger than ever. That night, as I closed the door of the cabin and listened to the wind move across the frozen lake, I realized something else. This victory was not just mine. It was proof to anyone watching, anyone who might be intimidated or bullied, that persistence, preparation, and patience could prevail against even the most audacious attempts at power. The ranch was mine. The lake was mine. And the lesson? Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone defending what is rightfully theirs. Winter had settled fully over the ranch by the time I felt the weight of a year begin to lift. Snow blanketed the rolling hills, coating fences and pines in quiet white. The lake, once the center of conflict, lay frozen and glassy under the low winter sun. The victory in court was final. The HOA's threats, the trespassing, the endless paperwork, all of it had come to an end. But the silence was almost unfamiliar. After months of constant vigilance, every morning spent checking cameras, inspecting fences, documenting trespasses, it felt strange to walk across the pasture without tension knotting my shoulders. For the first time in a long while, the ranch felt like home again. Not just a battlefield, but a place of peace. I walked along the frozen shoreline, boots crunching in rhythm with my own thoughts. The dock stretched out like an old friend, still solid despite the cold. I ran my hand over the rail, imagining my grandfather standing here decades ago, surveying the land he had built from nothing. He'd always said that owning land wasn't just about deeds or maps. It was about respect, stewardship, and a stubborn refusal to let anyone take it away. I'd finally understood what he meant. Over the months, the community had begun to shift as well. Neighbors who had once hesitated to speak now greeted me warmly. Some had been quietly watching the battle, unsure of the truth. Others had been caught in the HOA's web of misinformation. But now, after court rulings, documentation, and public transparency, the tide had turned. People recognized the reality. The ranch was mine, and it had been defended with integrity. Rachel visited that week to finalize the last of the legal documents, ensuring compliance, boundary recognition, and permanent protections against future HOA encroachments. She smiled as she handed me a thick folder, saying, "This is it, the last of it. You've done more than just protect property. You've set a precedent. People will look to your case for years." I nodded, quietly humbled. The fight had been exhausting, terrifying at times, and often lonely. But in the end, persistence and preparation had carried the day. I had learned more than property law. I had learned patience, strategy, and the importance of documenting every step when facing a powerful, determined adversary. The ranch itself seemed to respond to the calm. The cattle wandered freely, the lake reflected the sunlight perfectly, and the forest whispered quietly in the wind. I spent hours walking trails I had once patrolled warily, now able to enjoy the space as it was meant to be enjoyed. Every corner of land that had been threatened felt more precious than ever. I began documenting the ranch in a different way, not for defense, but for history. Old maps were digitized. Photographs taken of every building, every fence, every stretch of shoreline. I wrote notes about the trees, the water, and the subtle changes I had observed over the years. It was my way of honoring my grandfather's work, of preserving the story of the ranch not just as property, but as legacy. One afternoon, while clearing fallen branches near the lake, a young neighbor approached. He had been curious about the battle from the start, asking questions quietly, never taking sides publicly. He asked, "Do you ever worry they'll try again?" I looked out across the lake, then down at the snow-covered pastures, and smiled. "I don't think so," I said. "This ranch isn't just land. It's history, family, and proof that standing firm matters. Anyone who tried to take it now would have to go through more than me. They'd have to go through every ounce of evidence, preparation, and care that went into defending it. And that's a fight they can't win." The boy nodded slowly, understanding something beyond property law. He was learning about resilience, about the quiet strength of defending what's yours, and about the value of patience and planning. That evening, I sat on the dock as the sun sank behind the hills, the lake catching fire in reds and golds. The world felt vast, open, and safe. I thought about every confrontation, every legal filing, every moment of doubt. And yet, the memory of fear was tempered by satisfaction. I had faced intimidation from a powerful organization and emerged victorious, not by brute force, but through careful strategy, diligence, and the unwavering belief that truth and history matter. I reflected on the months of struggle. There had been moments I doubted myself, moments when the endless court filings and trespass incidents seemed too much. But every time, I remembered my grandfather's words, "Land only stays yours if you're willing to defend it." And now I understood fully. Ownership isn't just legal, it's moral, emotional, and practical. It's about stewardship and courage, about taking responsibility not just for the land, but for the history it carries. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted, revealing green shoots, budding trees, and the promise of new growth. I repaired fences, planted new trees along the pasture, and restored the shoreline where previous encroachments had caused minor damage. The land began to feel alive again, recovering not just from the seasons, but from the shadow of conflict that had hung over it for months. Neighbors stopped by, not to debate or negotiate, but to offer congratulations, to share stories, and sometimes just to watch the sun set over the lake. I realized that the ranch had become more than my family's legacy. It was a symbol of endurance, a quiet monument to what happens when one refuses to be intimidated by bureaucracy or bullying. One late afternoon, Rachel and I walked the boundaries together, ensuring the final legal protections were properly marked. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. She smiled and said, "You've done more than just protect your land. You've shown what's possible when someone refuses to back down." I thought about the months of struggle, the threats, the trespassing, the courtroom battles, and I realized that this victory was not about anger or revenge. It was about principle, legacy, and the understanding that persistence and preparation can overcome even the most audacious challenges. That night, I lit a fire in the cabin fireplace and looked out the window at the lake. The water mirrored the stars, still and reflective, as if acknowledging the end of a long battle. I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the legal victory, but for the lessons learned along the way. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every confrontation had strengthened me and deepened my connection to the land. The ranch was safe. The lake sparkled as if nothing had ever threatened it. The trees stood tall, the pastures stretched endlessly, and the sky reflected the promise of future mornings filled with peace rather than conflict. I knew the HOA might linger in memory, perhaps even in whispers, but their attempts to seize, intimidate, or rewrite history had failed. Completely. And so, as the fire crackled and the stars shone above, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Contentment. Not passive, not complacent, but the quiet, hard-won satisfaction that comes from standing firm, protecting what is yours, and emerging stronger than before. The ranch was mine. The lake was mine. The legacy of my grandfather was secure. And the story of this battle, of threats, trespassing, legal wrangling, and perseverance, would live on not just in documents and court filings, but in the land itself. Every tree, every blade of grass, every ripple in the lake carried the proof. Ownership is more than paper. It's about vigilance, courage, and the willingness to fight when it matters most. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the night wind rustle through the pines, and smiled. The battle was over, the ranch was safe, and the lesson endured. Some things, history, legacy, and land that matters, are worth every fight. The sun would rise again tomorrow over the lake, and when it did, I would be here, boots on the soil, hands on the dock, standing guard over a piece of the world I had fought to protect, and would protect for as long as I lived. The ranch was finally, truly mine,